Personally, I've never believed that bombing could settle any of these things. On the contrary, in my opinion, that bombing creates a sort of David and Goliath complex in any country that has to suffer bombing. We had that in 40. I mean, they can win a series of battles, they can even win a series of engagements in the jungle. But that a military victory can decide this conflict, I don't believe, because what matters is what happens after you've won your military victory. Do you believe that the Russians want what we used to call a détente in Europe? I would have thought that on the whole they did. I can't see the alternative except more intense fighting and dangerous for all a world conflict. I have in mind, if I may give one example, is this. Supposing, say, that the Americans have got an area which is settled, peaceful, to such a point that they feel the American garrison can be withdrawn from that actual area and the matter entrusted to the Viet Cong with their power to look after. All right, one or two things happen. Either that area remains inviolate, or else the Viet Cong step in, try to break it up. Either they succeed in breaking it up, in which case we're back again where we started, or else they fail to break it up, in which case it's a very considerable success for the South Vietnamese. But even if they succeed in breaking it up, the North, it's rather contrary to their statements hitherto that it's only the American presence that makes it necessary for them to fight South Vietnam. So I would like, here and there, in areas which are settled, to attempt an experimental move of that kind, and a very modified withdrawal, not out of the country necessarily, but withdrawal to some other position. See how that works out, and then gradually, step by step, fit that in if you can with your bombing program. Personally, I've never believed that bombing could settle any of these things. On the contrary, in my opinion, that bombing creates a sort of David and Goliath complex in any country that has to suffer bombing. We had that in 40, and I expect the Germans had it towards the end of the war. And I think that all those practicing the bombing probably instinctively exaggerate the effect of what they'll do, especially in a country you know better than I do. I don't know it, the Vietnamese country.
Prime Minister, I think you would have been regarded as what the Americans now call a hawk. Do you rule out any American military victory in Vietnam?
Well, I don't see what that can mean. I mean, they can win a series of battles, they can even win a series of engagements in the jungle. But that a military victory can decide this conflict, I don't believe, because what matters is what happens after you've won your military victory. Whether you're able to settle the country, whether you're able to build up an administration, whether that stands, and whether it represents the nation or doesn't. Those are the problems. Now, I tell you what troubles me about this. What troubles me is that the longer this business goes on, the more escalation there is, the more bombing, the wider the fighting, the greater the danger of a world conflict. There is a risk that we Anglo-Saxons, perhaps in particular, get used to when we see to this business going on, that nothing that's done can ever result in some countermeasures. I don't believe it. And I think that, nor do I believe that the Chinese are people who can be intimidated. I don't think either of those things. Therefore, it seems to me extremely dangerous to allow matters to go on as they are now. And that there isn't a great deal of time in which to try and get down on paper somewhere the kind of terms which might be not enjoyed but acceptable to all. And I've no ambition for this little bit of paper. I worked these out months ago, these little schemes, and they've had to be printed. But what I do hope is they might be cockshy. If everybody would say these are thoroughly bad ideas, but these are better, I should be more than satisfied. But what is not enough, in my judgment, is that our American friends should just say, I am prepared to talk. I am prepared to come to the table without conditions. Some plan laid out, not publicly if you don't want to, but some detailed scheme worked out of the kind of minimum which both sides think they can live with. And somebody ought to be doing that and hawking it round or putting it forward.
Now, if you were President Johnson at this moment, what would you be doing along those lines?
I feel great sympathy with the President. I don't believe he wanted to be landed with this one, if you ask my opinion of that. I think he would be very happy to be rid of it. That's why I think that again, that Ho Chi Minh and the Chinese are wrong in thinking he wants to be a warlord in this. I don't believe it. Well, now, supposing our judgment, your judgment and mine are the same about that, then I should imagine if I was a president, I would dearly like to get the State Department, somebody, perhaps they're doing it, perhaps they've done it, I don't know, but to work out in detail, not necessarily a scheme like this, but a scheme which tries to do what this little scheme of mine tries to do. Produce terms in detail, because it's no good in generalities, but in practical detail of what might be conceivably acceptable as a final solution.
Now, a key point in this is presumably the attitude of the Russians. Mr. Wilson has just been to Moscow to try to reopen the co-chairmanship of the 54 conference without apparently much success. You, in 54, had Russian support, and it appears that we now don't have this. How is one going to overcome that?
Of course, it's much more difficult now, I admit it frankly. The Russians in 54 had a similar interest to us not to see the conflict spread. And I think Molotov certainly played his part very well in that business, and I think he agreed with me there was a real danger of world war then. We both thought so and said so to each other privately. Well, now it's different because the Russians, even if they feel as we felt then, haven't the same influence over the Chinese. There's the difficulty. All the same, all the same, the Russians have an influence. And I think the Russians must be thinking of this, mustn't they? Do you believe that the Russians want what we used to call a détente in Europe? I would have thought that on the whole they did. That the anxiety about China and other things must make them feel they'd like to improve their relations with the West. Well, if this war goes on a long time and gets bitterer and bitterer, as it's bound to do, the chances of improved relations between East and West in Europe, in my judgment, are going to fade. Because if you can use such a term as a liberal communist, a communist who anyhow perhaps would rather work with the West or have easier relations with the West. If this Vietnam thing gets more bitter, he won't have a chance, because they will say, everybody, how can you think of having easier relations with the West when their ally, the United States, behaves like that? In other words, this conflict is going to have far-reaching consequences all around the world as it goes on and as it intensifies. And one of those consequences is going to be to align more sharply the communist countries and the countries of the free world. Don't think that Russia wants that.
Do you see an end to the fighting as a necessary preliminary to the sort of negotiations you're talking about, or could they go on at the same time?
I think they could go on, but I think you can't. I think your first instruction for the actual conference will be to the military to draw out what I might call the terms of disentanglement for the forces. That will be your first instruction at a conference. But while that was being done, the conference could go on working, as indeed it did at Geneva.
What do you think, can I ask you quite frankly, what do you think of the chances of a plan like yours being put into effect in the foreseeable future?
I should think the odds are against. On the other hand, I have seen international situations where the odds were at least as heavily, if not more heavily against, and something's come out. I didn't really give much hope for our chances after Dien Bien Phu in 1954. It looked very, very black indeed, and in the end something came out. So anyhow, you've got to go for it, haven't you? Because I cannot see what else you're going to go for, myself, but some detailed plan.
In your experience of diplomacy, Lord Avon, over a very long period of time, do you think that people really believe in the sort of guarantees you're suggesting for a neutral zone, that both sides will observe them? Do they have that much faith in each other? Well,
there's never been any diplomatic instrument in the world which is foolproof. You can't make it so, or knave-proof, if you like. But it may be that you can start something of this kind, and that on balance, it's to nobody's interest to break it up. I dare say many people will stretch it on either side or another, but maybe each of the parties will decide it isn't worth busting it. That's all. Do you remember the trouble there used to be over Trieste? Just after the war, terrible business. And the Italians and the Yugoslavs, it took ages to arrange. And I remember the arguments. We had 6 months negotiation, quiet diplomatic negotiation. And I remember while it's going on, lots of people should say, all right, you'll get your agreement. It'll last a few weeks. And then there'll be more trouble. Well, we got the agreement, and actually it's lasted many years. And no doubt Trieste's got his troubles. Have not been Italian-Yugoslav troubles. And the same thing could happen again. History really teems with examples of that.
I was going to ask you then, if unfortunately you are right and the chances are against a plan like yours being accepted, what's the alternative in Vietnam? How long does this go on?
I can't see the alternative except more intense fighting and dangerous for all the world conflict, which is why I thought it was worth trying even this little thing.
Lord Avon, thank you.